Okay, everybody, for this section, we're going to talk about how the Constitution is made and some of the things that went into it, some of the political fights that happened. And then we'll talk about separation of powers. And then at the end, we'll talk about direct democracy and how direct democracy works here in California. Okay, so as you can see, we're going to look at the origins of the Constitution. We're going to see how we developed a Republican form of government. We're going to discuss some of the compromise and negotiations that went into developing the Constitution. We're going to talk about the importance of, the founders having a type of economic stability. And we're going to talk about how checks and balances will assist elites and how checks and balances can affect our everyday lives, especially with the separation of powers doctrine that is out there. So if you look at this little hierarchy chart, here is what it looked like right after the revolution and the Declaration of Independence passed. So you can see elites were at the top, and then we had a hierarchical society that went down. And as you can see, poor people were obviously at the very bottom. And we did have kind of a little bit of a segment of the middle class, but we'll see, kind of in the future in this class when the middle class really started to develop, right? And then we'll look at how, kind of throughout history, the middle class is kind of been the staple of a lot of electoral contests here in the United States. So one of the things that we're going to talk about kind of is and we'll look a little bit more when we get to talking about ideologies, and we'll focus on this part and the influence that John Locke had on writing the Declaration of Independence and actually kind of developing our early American political thought. John Locke believed in something called social contract theory, right? And the whole premise of social contract theory, and this is going to kind of be different throughout each philosopher, and each philosopher will have an idea of how people are naturally wired or how people are naturally, kind of predisposed to behave when they're within their state of nature. And when I talk about state of nature, I'm specifically speaking about, a process or a moment when an individual is not corrupted or influenced or seduced by any type of wealth or power. I always like to make an analogy that our state of nature is best shown when we're a newborn, because what cares do we have as a newborn? Nothing, right? When do we need to eat? Well, we need to eat often, but do we have to go out and find our own food? No, mom will provide it. So the state of nature is kind of a perfect time where we have really no cares and no things that can come in and corrupt us. And kind of Locke believed that a lot of forces like selfishness and all that stuff would corrupt us out of our state of nature. But he also kind of believed that we were free to live as individuals as long as we consented to the government's laws. And in turn, by that consent, the government was going to protect our life, liberty, and property. All right, so kind of an important thing to understand. Social contract theory focuses on the fact that we give up certain rights, and in turn, the government will protect our life, liberty, and property. Now, if we kind of look at some of the things that happened and kind of the pathways to revolution and to the development of the Constitution, originally we had some aspects of monopolistic mercantilism, where there's a navigation acts that were set out and they were laxly enforced. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But they reflected a policy of mercantilism, which sought to keep all the benefits of trade inside of the English Empire and to minimize the loss of gold and silver to foreign countries or foreigners. One of the things that was kind of focused on when we looked at the development of the Constitution, there was a belief that the Constitution was the Articles of Confederation was a weak document, and we needed to rewrite that document to maybe in a sense, give a little bit more power back to the federal government. So the Alexandria Conference existed. Maryland and Virginia dealt with navigation and commerce in Chesapeake Bay and the Potomac and the Pocomoke rivers. They wanted to include all states to adopt some type of trade regulations. States were acting out with their own trading ways, and it kind of prevented the U.S. economy from fully developing. We also had a meeting in Annapolis where 12 delegates from 5 states adopted a report outlining the defects in the articles, and then it called for a whole new convention to be set in May 1787. So what did the founders believe in when we talk about protecting liberty and property? The founders agreed that the fundamental end of government is to protect our individual liberty. So the founders, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, James Madison, George Washington, all believed that it was the government's responsibility to protect our individual liberty, right? They believed in law of nature, where people are endowed with certain inalienable rights, life, liberty, and property. Right. So we kind of, when we look at the Declaration of Independence, we could see that in the Declaration of Independence, there was a sense that Jefferson wrote that we are all entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which is directly influenced by these 3 points that Locke had pointed out. And it's kind of my belief that when Jefferson was writing the Declaration of Independence, he changed it from life, liberty, and property to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, because who could vote during this time? Who were elites during this time? It was mostly property owners. So I think if you would consider property an inalienable right, then you have to provide it to people, and you would just enfranchise everybody. So again, they were probably strategically really trying to keep power concentrated to the elites of that society, and therefore they didn't want just everybody to be able to have property. And when we talk about equality in this case, we're going to talk a little bit more about equality of opportunity down the line, where we talk about things like affirmative action. But right now, we're going to talk about equality under the law, that we should all be equal under the law. And we're going to see as we go through the Constitution that the 14th Amendment, the 5th Amendment are 2 vital amendments that kind of protect our equality and our feelings of being equal under the law. Remember, according to the founders, equality didn't necessarily mean equal in wealth, intelligence, virtue, and talent. We're going to actually look at that more down the line. So kind of remember this and put a mental bookmark where we're going to refer to this probably toward the end of the semester when we start talking about civil rights. Also, as part of that kind of that equality of outcome, the founders did not believe that the government had a responsibility to reduce inequalities that people had. They did believe in what's called a Republican form of government, or republicanism. And we're not talking about the political party. We're talking about where we have elected representatives to represent our interests in Washington, D.C. Right? So they believed in a Republican form of government, representative, responsible, and non-hereditary, which was a very important topic or important point. We do still see, kind of that hereditary system in government. Not intentionally, but we do see families and people with the same last name at times serving us, whether it's the Bushes or even here in San Diego, there was a congressman out in the El Cajon area whose name was Duncan Hunter. He retired from Congress, and who took over? Duncan Hunter, his son. So, not intentionally hereditary, but we do have aspects of it, right? Because we didn't want aristocracy. We wanted a limited form of democracy that prevented the masses from having a really large influence, where it moves to more of an indirect influence on how government operates. They expected the masses to consent to government. So that social contract that we see, right? And that these representatives that we've had in Congress are supposed to be men of principle and property. And remember, I'm using the gender male now because, as we know, women were at that time treated as possessions. And he generally agreed that the masses should have only limited indirect role in selecting decision makers. And we're going to look at that more and more as we get to talking about elections, where we'll see, the only thing that we could have voted for on directly during that time is representation in Congress for the House of Representatives, not for the Senate or not for the president. We're going to address that later. They also believed in a limited form of government, and government could not threaten liberty or property. So we have to divide governments into separate bodies that are able to check one another so that one does not pose a huge threat to the other. So these three separate bodies, the judicial, the legislative, and the executive, are all run separately by different individuals, chosen differently, and they have to have checks so one branch does not become stronger than the other. We're going to look a little bit more as we go down the line into some of those controversies that the branches of government may at times conflict, and where, it's kind of evolved where one branch of government is, in a sense, stronger than the others when they're not supposed to be. They're supposed to be equal, but there's going to be some aspects where that may kind of evolve. If we look kind of in a world context, a lot of other governments were hereditary governments, monarchies, kind of the whole divine right of kings, where you are bestowed by God to be a leader. The U.S. elites believed in equality and inalienable human rights, which were life, liberty, and property. So in the concept of developing the Constitution and deciding what type of representation government we were going to have, there were a couple of plans put into place, and I'm going to want you to know these two plans and then the eventual compromise. The first plan was the Virginia plan, and this was a two-house legislature where we had the lower house that was voted by the citizens, and then the lower house would then choose the upper house. Congress would have the ability to nullify state laws, and it was a proposed parliamentary form of government. So if any of you have taken any other type of political science classes, or maybe have maybe looked at something like UK politics, especially in England, England has the House of Lords and the House of Commons, right? The House of Lords is considered more prestigious. The House of Commons is chosen by the citizens. In turn, then the citizens will choose the House of Commons, and then the House of Commons will choose the House of Lords. And kind of going along with this, then the ruling party in Parliament will choose a prime minister. So you can kind of see where the legislative branch and the executive branch are kind of amalgamated a bit. Congress would also choose executive and judiciary branches, like we said. There was another plan out of New Jersey. New Jersey wanted a one-house legislature, one vote per state, separate executive and judiciary, and give Congress the powers to tax and regulate commerce. There was a compromise because neither plan was totally adhered to by the whole group. So what they did was they eventually compromised and struck a deal which is known as the Connecticut Compromise. You have a two-house legislature with the lower house based on population, and the upper will be equal to senators per state. So we have 435 districts here in the United States. 435 representatives make up the House of Representatives. We'll talk a little bit about territories and delegates a little bit later in the semester. But for the most part, there's going to be 435 members of the House, and there's going to be 2 senators per state, so there's 100. So we have 535 members of Congress, and we will discuss and talk a little bit about that later in the semester. Now, issues like slavery needed to be addressed. So slavery was still, kind of America's original sin, and some of the problems that we still had in addressing that during that time. So obviously, the majority of the slaves were in the South, but slaves were considered citizens, they were considered property. So for the purposes of representation, remember, our representation in those 435 districts now are based off of population. So we have the census every 10 years. It is done to make sure to see how we can allocate representatives to each part of Congress. So obviously, since the South had areas some had higher populations, if you counted slaves, the people in the South wanted to be counted for representational purposes only. So there's a compromise struck, and this was put into the Constitution. We had 3/5 of the slave would count as one person, even though those people still would not have any type of citizenship rights. So we had the 3/5 compromise, where 3/5 of the slaves of each state would be counted for the purposes of representation and appropriating direct taxes. And we'll talk about appropriations a little bit later in the term. Congress prohibited the slave trade, but not before 1808. And Article 4, Section 2 of the Constitution guaranteed the return of enslaved slaves. So I just wanted to show you where slavery is addressed in the Constitution, having you be able to understand that. So there's also trade and commerce compromise. The states under the Articles of Confederation were interfering with the development of our economy at the national level. Southern planters feared that Congress may impose some type of export tax. The compromise met where articles exported from any state should bear no tax or duty. Only imports could be taxed by the national government to protect U.S. interests against foreign goods. So we'll talk, like I said, I keep saying this, we'll talk a little bit more about things like tariffs a little bit down the line. But for the most part, what this is saying is that, say if we have a product that is made in California and we sell it to somebody in Arizona, we can't put a tax or a duty on that. Sales tax is totally something different. So we're talking about a tax on commerce, which the Constitution prohibits. Also, the concept of voting was something that was looked upon. We had mass voting participation was not favored by the delegates, so you didn't want everybody to be able to vote. So at this time, slaves weren't given the right to vote, women were not given the right to vote, and it was the responsibility of the states to decide who could and couldn't vote. And this is another thing that is kind of controversial with what we're going to talk about, where we're going to talk about laws that have been put in place to restrict a person's ability to vote. And each state will have different qualifications for people to be able to vote. Here nationwide, our whole thing is flat. You have to be 18 and a U.S. citizen to be able to vote. But states can put in restrictions on how to vote, voter ID laws, should prisoners be able to vote, and so on. So, we'll get more into that discussion as we go along. Congress was granted the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises. Taxes, as we know what they are, duties are goods that you export. Taxes you pay on that to foreign countries. And then excises, a good example of an excise is like a tax on gasoline. So if next time you go to the gas pump, and there might be an itemized list of where each cent of your gas tax goes to, there's going to be an excise tax that is put there, and the government collects that money. This enabled the government to end its dependence on the states and gave the federal government the power to generate revenue through taxation. Article 6 of the Constitution committed the U.S. to paying off all the investors who held bonds. Taxing power is guaranteed that this commitment will be filled. Basically, a bond, and we'll talk more about this when we get to federalism. A bond is a kind of a piece of paper that you can buy, and it is guaranteed. So what you do is, if the government is trying to build some type of huge project, usually they don't have the money, cash on hand to pay for that whole project, up front. So what they have to do is they have to raise money in order to be able to complete that project, and they'll do it by issuing bonds, usually municipal bonds or treasury bonds. So what you do is you give your money let's say it's $25. You go buy a $25 bond. You give the government $25. They'll give you the bond, which is basically a piece of paper. There'll be a low interest rate on it, and then the government will use that money that they sell for the bond to fund a big project, an infrastructure project. But they're going to pay you back. Those bonds are guaranteed, but there's not too much of a return on investment as a stock would be. But a bond is just something where you can go and, like I said, help fund a project. It's going to be, for the most part, guaranteed money that you'll get back, but it's not going to be a high yield or high profit that you'll make off of it. They also looked at protecting money and credit. So Section 8 of Article 1 in the Constitution enables the Congress to protect money and property, so they can make bankruptcy laws, right? Bankruptcies obviously are, if your debts outweigh your assets, you can have a federal judge discharge your responsibilities or your debts to a company, and you might not have to pay those off. One thing about it is a problem may be that your credit is going to be damaged for up to 7 years. Another thing that was done was the coining money and regulating value. So making sure that each state kind of respects the fact that only the federal government, can coin money and regulate its value. They can issue what's called a fixed standard of weights and measures. So an ounce in California is going to be an ounce in Nebraska. A pound in Nevada is going to be a pound in Florida. So kind of a consistent way of having a standard weights and measures that we have out there. Punishing counterfeiting, establishing a post office, and protecting copyright and patent. So next time you watch the UFC and you watch it on one of those streams, that may be in violation of copyright laws. Or if you download a movie off the internet that hasn't been released, that might be a violation of copyright law. Just kind of putting that out there. That's why you see those little disclaimers before. And to protect money and credit, like we said, state governments have been issuing cheap paper money, allowing debtors to pay their creditors with money worth less than the original loan. So you had to centralize that and make a standard form of currency that was issued by the federal government. Also opened Western land to speculation. Native Americans discouraged immigration west. We had prior to the revolution, the colonists would try to kind of colonialize places out west and take Native Americans' land, which is a really another sad instance that we had in our country. But we did start seeing a slow mobility or movement out west. That's to create a military, right? Not just to protect against foreign invaders, also to protect against piracy. So Article 1, Section 8, and Article 2 provide centralized diplomatic and military affairs at the national level. And we'll talk about a little bit more in the term about how some of these individual branches of government deals with diplomacy and policy and all that. But the federal government is responsible for creating a military and engaging in diplomacy. Like I said, a strong Navy was essential to protection of U.S. commerce on the seas because piracy was a real danger. Kind of old traditional, not necessarily the Johnny Depp pirates, but kind of the same idea where, pillaging and taking commerce that is being shipped. A national army and navy were not so much to protect against invasion, but also to protect against, and as protection and promotion of the government's commercial and territorial ambitions. So A, to protect, and B, also to protect from piracy. Also to protect against revolution. Federalist 12 refers to Shays' Rebellion, and I want you to look a little bit about Shays Rebellion. I'm going to post a video about Shays Rebellion so you can understand Shays Rebellion. Debtors Rebellion that happened. We'll talk a little bit more about it. But if you look at Article 4, Section 4, the national government guarantees to every state or republic a form of government, as well as protections against domestic violence and insurrection. Now, we've heard that word insurrection in the past couple of years, and we'll get into that, some of the aspects of that. The supremacy clause is also kind of drawn out in here. So laws of Congress supersede laws of the state, and it made it certain Congress would control interstate commerce, bankruptcy, monetary affairs, transportation, communications, and military affairs. So basically what the supremacy clause says is that all laws that are made by Congress or that are detailed in the Constitution will trump state law, right? So federal law is going to override state law. Now, the 10th Amendment gives the states the ability to make their own laws as long as they don't infringe on the powers of Congress or violate a constitutional right that we may have. So a good example is this. Look at the marijuana law here in California. So Prop 64, passed in 2016, made cannabis use for recreational purposes legal. Cannabis use for medicinal purposes was already legal prior to that, but what it does is it allows people to use, to meet certain criteria and pay certain taxes. You could use cannabis legally here in California if you're over a certain age. With that being said, cannabis is still a Schedule I narcotic on the federal level. So what the federal government says is that cannabis is a no-no, right? So since it's a federal narcotic, it's still illegal. So hypothetically, if the United States government wanted to, they could come into California and shut down the dispensaries and charge people who are using cannabis or selling cannabis. They could charge them federally. Now, are they going to do that under the Biden administration? Probably not. Because I don't want to say probably, I'm going to say definitely not, because the Biden administration has taken the position that we should legalize cannabis as well. So, but during the Trump administration, there were some kind of fears that the Trump administration may try to impose federal will on states and allow them to be able to shut down dispensaries. So, but just remember, federal law is always going to outweigh state law. And it's just a little bit more about the cannabis law here. Like we say here in America, cannabis is in California is legal, but if the federal government wanted to, they could shut down the dispensaries. So we look at republicanism in operation. We could see that people in the House of Representatives are elected to 2-year terms. At that time, state legislatures would then elect the U.S. senators to 6-year terms. Electors, such as state legislators, will choose and select the president, which we'll talk about later. And federal judges were to be appointed by the president for life. And we'll definitely talk about that because that could be a potential problem. So kind of going into the whole separation of powers doctrine and the form of checks and balances that we have here in the government. One of the things that I'm going to want you all to take a quick look at is Federalist 51. And Federalist 51 was written by James Madison. And he believed that we needed separation of powers to safeguard against a majoritarian type of system and have protections of life, liberty, and property that would prevent tyranny of the majority. So basically, tyranny of the majority is if the majority wants something, it's usually majority rule in our society, but there has to be protections for the minority. And when I say minority, I'm talking about people in the 49% and below category. So one of the good examples of this is, and we'll talk a little bit more about this when we get to the Supreme Court part, but Proposition 8 in 2008 here in California tried to define marriage as a union between a man and a woman. That was passed. It was an initiative that was passed. 53% of the population wanted it passed. there's some other reasons why it passed. We'll talk more about that when we get into direct democracy. But just remember, 53% of the population wanted it passed. But eventually what happened was it was challenged to the courts, where the courts were checking these laws that were put into Congress. I mean, not into Congress, but into activity by the public. With that being said, so there has to be some type of ways that the minority, the people in the 49% below, can address their grievances in this instance. So what the courts found was that by limiting the definition of marriage to it only being a union between a man and a woman, the minority, the people in the 49% below, their rights are being adversely affected. So our separation of checks and balances put that into view, where we could see that these rights of the minority were being violated, and we had tyranny of the majority at this time. So it'll look a little bit more clearer when we kind of go on and on into our talk here. So each major decision-making body is chosen by a different constituency. The president is chosen by the Electoral College. The legislatures are chosen by the people, and the judicial is chosen by the executive branch. One of the things that Madison wrote in Federalist 51, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. So in a sense, what he's saying is, we can't trust each other to do the right thing. So we have to have things that are put into place to make sure that the rights of the minority are protected. And like I said, this will make a lot more sense when we go through. And I want you all to really pay attention to this, because this is going to be part of our first essay that we're going to write. So the separation of powers is a doctrine of constitutional law under which the three branches of government are kept separate. The executive carries out and enforces laws. The legislative branch makes laws, and the judicial branch will interpret laws through court actions. And we'll see it, throughout the class. We'll see this in real time. So if you look at this, go ahead and take a look at this chart. It'll show you kind of the checks that each body will have on each other. So I'm going to want you guys maybe to take about 10, 15 minutes when we're done here and look at this slide and maybe try to visualize in your head how, or if you see any type of maybe real world scenarios you could think about, like a court action or a vetoing of a bill or an overriding a veto. How the other branches come together and check each other, so to speak. Are there any consequences of it? Well, due to slow-moving legislation and the influence of the courts, sometimes it's easier just not to go through the headache of going and passing a bill or doing a constitutional challenge on a court of law. Sometimes it's easier just to keep things the way they are. But it makes majority rule possible as long as it does not interfere on the rights of the minority. And that's one of the big things about, our separation of powers doctrine and our system of checks and balances. We have to make it that majority rules, but we also have to protect the right of the minority. And I think that's something that we really, really need to understand. One of the things that we have kind of out of, an example of this is the concept of judicial review. The Supreme Court has the power to invalidate not only state laws, but also laws made by Congress that conflict with the Constitution. This was given to them through a court case called Marbury versus Madison. And like I said, this gives the courts the ability to invalidate laws and actions by Congress or even by the executive branch to determine them to be unconstitutional. So this also sets up a federalist system of government. The United States has a federalist system of government where a central government that has certain powers with the state as the basic unit of political power. We'll talk more about that next week. And that allocation of power between the states and the federal government has been a point of contention from the Articles of Confederation all the way to today. And we'll talk more about this in future classes. there's obviously a Federalist faction and an anti-Federalist faction. So the faction of anti-Federalists was opposed to ratification of the new Constitution. It took prestige and power from state and local governments, threatened civil liberties, and they believed it was a design monarch because it gave a lot of power to the federal government. So the Constitution was eventually ratified on September 17, 1787, and it's still in place now, and it's been amended. We'll talk about the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights was penned in 1791 by Madison, and it basically was a call from states to protect individual liberties from governmental intrusion. And it has a specific list of specific prohibitions on governmental power, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. We also have a constitution here in California. You know, our federal constitution, our U.S. Constitution, has only been amended 27 times. Our California Constitution has been amended 480 times. And the reason it's so much is that we as citizens of California, have the ability to amend the California Constitution. We'll talk more about that when we get into direct democracy. Okay, so next we will talk about certain provisions of the Constitution. We'll look at the Bill of Rights, and then we'll talk about direct democracy.
Okay, everybody, in this section, we're going to be talking about direct democracy and how that works here in California. So let's go ahead and take a look. So first of all, we have to kind of ask ourselves, why do we look at California? Why do we study California? Obviously, we live here, right? Simple as that. California is the crossroads of America. When you think about it, we have every race, ethnicity, religion, orientation here in California. And it's kind of truly representative of the United States. Latinx people make up about 35% of the population, and 60% of that is of Mexican heritage. And there's a belief that by maybe 2030 or 2033, 2035, that Latinx people would be the majority here in California. So we're a relatively young demographic. The mean age is about 35 years old. If California was its own country, it would be ranked within the top 10 economies in the world. We have a lot of migration into California. We have military bases, jobs, tech, that people move into California to be employed in. So 50% of Californians were born in California. And we have a population of about 39 million people, which is the largest population of a state in the country. So I'm going to go over a little bit where California has kind of evolved and been birthed throughout kind of our history. We first have our Spanish colonial period, which was from 1776 to 1821. The Spaniards wanted to fortify control in North America. European colonial powers began to construct fortifications to protect their settlements from foreign encroachment. The Spanish Empire had made several claims to California and sought to consolidate its position in, North America as a colonial power. Spaniards were in Mexico, even down into Central America and some parts of South America, and they also moved up into North America. Now, the Spanish and the Mexicans fought a war for independence. In 1821, Mexico gained their independence from Spain. September 15th, which is Mexican Independence Day. We have El Grito that happens in Mexico, where people, get together and at midnight they yell "Viva Mexico." A lot of people might think that Independence Day is Cinco de Mayo, but that's not true. It is September 15th into the 16th, where Mexicans celebrate their independence. Following a successful revolt later that year, the colony won its freedom from Spain. Alta California, which encompasses present-day California, passed quietly into Mexican control. And during this time, we also started to see the migration of people who were moving out west into areas that kind of upset uh, the Mexicans, and were kind of looked at as a way to, I mean, as a way that their land is being encroached on by people moving out west. James Polk talked about something called the manifest destiny, where he believed that it was the United States' destiny to spread across the continent from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. American settlers, moved by huge numbers into California, um, being supported by indigenous tribes, and they revolted against the Mexican government. And the Mexican-American War marked the first U.S. armed conflict chiefly fought on foreign soil, and it pitted a politically divided and militarily unprepared Mexico against the expansionist-minded administration of James Polk in the United States, and far more advanced technology than what the Mexicans had, and really more kind of a one-sided fight, in that even though the Mexicans fought tough and hard, um, the war ended and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed. And what this did was it ended the Mexican-American War in favor of the United States, and it also granted the United States about 525,000 square miles of territory to them, which includes Arizona, California, Colorado, Nevada, New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming. So you can see a great portion of the western part of the United States. Mexico also gave up claims to Texas and recognized the Rio Grande River, which is the river that's on the border of El Paso and Juarez, Mexico. That is a southern boundary that is kind of a natural boundary, where one side of the river is Mexico and one side of the river is the United States. Now, a lot of our other borders are hard borders, which are defined by fencing and territorial lines now. The gold rush also happened. The discovery of gold up in the Sacramento Valley in 1848 brought a lot of people into the United States who are panning for gold, or into California who are. So kind of the lure of quick riches brought people from different parts of the United States into northern part of California. As news spread to discovery, thousands of miners traveled by sea or over to or land to San Francisco and the surrounding areas, especially up in the northern part. Country, I mean, a part of the country called Eureka, part of the state called Eureka, is another area that gold was mined in. And for those of you that follow football, NFL football, the 49ers, San Francisco 49ers are actually named after these prospectors who went out and extracted about $2 billion worth of precious gold and metal from that area. We also saw the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. In 1862, the Pacific Railroad Act chartered that the Central Pacific Railroad and the Union Pacific Railroad would merge, and they would task them with building a transcontinental railroad, or a railroad across the continent of North America, or indeed the United States, which would link east to west. And they would have a competition to see who could meet who first, right? So over the next 7 years, the two companies would race toward each other from Sacramento, California on one end, and Omaha, Nebraska on the other, struggling against great risk before they met at Promontory, Utah, on May 10th, 1869. So think about this. Why would this benefit citizens? Why would a transcontinental railroad benefit people? We can move merchandise and we can move people, right? So just kind of keep that in mind. That was one of the reasons that, this whole transcontinental railroad was so ambitious, that it was used to move people as well as commerce, and in a quicker time. The Central Pacific was built by Chinese immigrants, numbering more than 50,000, Irish immigrants, as well as Civil War vets and Mexicans helped build the Union Pacific. So we look at our ideology here in the NSF. When we talk about ideology, we talk about political leanings, right? For the most part, California is a really democratic state. There are different areas of California that tend to be a little bit more conservative than others. And I think you can even break it down to areas within San Diego that might be a little bit more liberal than conservative. San Francisco and LA are the a couple of the most liberal cities here in the United States, and even, especially in California. San Diego is maybe something at the midpoint, I would say. Also depending on the area that you live in San Diego, kind of south of the 52 will generally be a little bit more democratic. North of the 52 up into maybe the 78 would be a little bit more Republican. East County, San Diego, Santee, El Cajon is going to tend to be a little bit more Republican. But there's different parts of the city, and when we look at the Electoral College, we'll look at a really specific map that we could see where there might be points in different parts of the city that voted differently in the presidential election, and we'll look into a little bit more depth on that. Orange County is relatively conservative in some of the affluent areas in Orange County, like Newport Beach or Laguna Hills, some of those places that have a little bit more money that you need to be able to live there. But then again, once you go into Santa Ana and Anaheim, it tends to be a little bit more Democrat. And we'll look at that map when we get toward talking about the Electoral College. Is California problematic? Can California direct democracy cause issues? In some instances, it can, right? The budget, and I kind of neglected to talk about our own House legislature here, our two House legislature. We have two legislative chambers here in the United States, in California. One is called the Assembly, which is composed of 80 members, and one is composed of the California Senate, which has 40 members. And they represent different areas of the state in Sacramento for us citizens. Here in California, we have 53 representatives in the House. This is going to be changing to, I believe, 52 due to the 2020 census. And we'll talk about redistricting and the single member districts a little bit later in the term. Now, when we talk about California, can direct democracy cause issues? At times it can, and we'll talk about it. But, to keep in mind, when we go into talking about it, remember Madison's tyranny of the majority. There's avenues to help maybe people whose rights are being adversely affected by these direct democracy decisions that are made. And when we talk about direct democracy, these are all decisions that we can make as citizens that affect laws and statutes here in California. Remember, California is a majoritarian state due to our right to direct democracy. So majority is going to rule, but at times you might need a supermajority, which is 66% when we need to raise or lower a tax. Or there are also avenues that groups can take if we have an aspect of tyranny of the majority. So let's take a look at the direct democracy movement here in the progressive movement that happened in the early part of the 20th century. Hiram Johnson was elected governor in 1910. He wanted to limit corruption and restore democratic principles. So he brought direct democracy to the California Constitution in 1911. And this gives us the ability to use something called an initiative, something called a referendum, and something called a recall. And we'll talk about these individually in a minute. But if you look at this map of the United States and you see the yellowed shaded areas, these are states that have direct and indirect initiatives here in the United States. We do not have indirect initiatives here in California. We only have direct initiatives, and we'll talk a little bit of the aspects of that in a minute. But just keep in mind, roughly a little more than half of the states have the ability to petition their state government to either change a law or set up a law or whatever. And we'll talk about that as we go along. Placing an initiative on the ballot here in the United States is relatively easy, right? So keep that in mind. And when we say initiative, you may be a little bit more familiar with another name that they use, and that's called a proposition. So we see propositions that are coming out right now. If you're watching the news or television right now, you might see a lot of commercials for Proposition 26, Proposition 27. Those are initiatives that we'll talk about in a little bit. This has been used a lot of times, especially since 1978, and we'll watch a video about Proposition 13, which was a major initiative that changed the way schools, police, and fire are funded, which limited property tax to 1% of our assessed value. So we'll talk about that in a minute. So like I said, in direct democracy, we have an initiative where a percentage of voters using a petition. So, I mean, many of you probably have gone to a Vons or a Target or something, or a Walmart, and have somebody shove a piece of paper in your face asking you to sign. That is usually a petition to get an initiative on the ballot. Referendums are a little bit different. Referendums are kind of an initiative, but it's promulgated or it's produced by the California legislature, and they want the people to vote on. Doesn't happen that often. So a referendum is where the California Assembly and Senate put out a law, and they want the voters to decide whether or not that law should be enacted. We also have the ability to recall. And what we can do with the recall is we can remove an elected official before his or her term ends. And we'll talk a little bit more of the nuances of that in a little bit. So here in California, we have two types of initiatives. We don't have an indirect initiatives. Both of the initiatives that we have are direct initiatives. The first one is a state constitutional amendment where we as citizens can, in a sense, amend our state constitution. The other initiative that we have is a statute initiative where we as citizens can develop a law that will be put into place. If a majority of people want it to be done, we could do that. So remember that state constitutional amendment or a statute, which is basically a law. So there's a couple of things that we need to do in order to get something on the ballot. And one thing that you're going to need is you're going to need money, right? So all you need is $2,000 and an idea. And what you do is you make a down payment or a deposit of that $2,000. Then you circulate your initiative for 150 days. Prior to that, you have to send a full text of the measure or the law to the California Attorney General's Initiative Coordinator with the request for a summary, contact info, signed statement, certifying that proponents are qualified electors, and a $2,000 deposit. Now, one thing to keep in mind is if your proposition qualifies or if your initiative qualifies for the ballot, you get that $2,000 back. But if your proposition does not qualify for the ballot, you lose $2,000. So, you know, you can see it takes money, right? There's going to be a public input period. There must be a 30-day period where the public can review and discuss the initiative and give their input. Proponents are allowed to alter the initiative according to suggestions and discussions that they have with the public. After that, there is a summary that is done by the Attorney General's office. Once proponents have submitted all the required material, the Attorney General must draft a brief 100-word circulating title and summary of the initiative. And then they're given a number. It's not the number that we see on the ballot, but they're given an initiative number. And then the Attorney General has 15 days to complete the petition language. Then once the petition language is completed, then the signature gatherers can go out and start gathering signatures. And one of the things that also has to be reviewed is potential fiscal impact. So how much money is it going to use to pass this initiative, or what effect on the economy is this initiative going to cause? What money is going to be generated? So there has to be a lot that is put into it, and kind of giving the voter flow disclosure of what is going to be on that ballot and what that initiative is going to cost the public. So when we go out for an initiative and get our petition signature, so these are the people at Vons right now that go out and have us sign stuff. You have to be a registered voter to do it, right? So they have to gather X number of voters in the last gubernatorial race in order for an initiative to qualify for the ballot. So there's going to be two criteria that we need. right? So for a constitutional initiative, you need 8% of the number of voters in the last gubernatorial election to approve that measure or to approve that initiative, right? So 8%, that is 997,138 people. For a law or a statute initiative, a statutory initiative, you need 5% or 623,211 people to sign that petition. So just remember those numbers, wink, wink, hint, hint. Know the differences in the numbers between the constitutional initiative that is needed in a petition and the statutory initiative criteria that is needed in position. Constitutional initiative, 8%. Statutory initiative, 5%. So generally you need a lot of money to be able to qualify an initiative on the ballot and to run your election. News spots are expensive. Having staff paying petition gatherers, petition signer gatherers are expensive. So without about $1 to $2 million, you can't really get anything on the ballot. You need money or capital to help pay people. If you have that money, you could practically get anything on the ballot, no matter how wacky. Proposition 6, which was attempted in 1998 and passed, it was the prohibition of horse slaughter and sale of horse meat for human consumption. So that's something that's illegal here in California. Once you get all your signatures, each local registrar of voters will confirm that the people that signed the petition are able to sign the petition. So they'll do a random sampling to see how many people are able to sign that petition. So they'll maybe check every 50 signature, every 100 signature. Now, there are instances where a full count signature can be requested, where they check everybody's signature, or they verify everybody's signature, but obviously that's going to take a lot of time. So just kind of keep that in mind. If you want to raise a tax or start a new tax, if it is a referendum or initiative that is proposed by the government, you need 66% of voters to approve it in order to raise a tax, to create a new tax, or even to eliminate a tax. That's a very hard number to get to. We'll talk about the Charger Stadium issue in a little bit. If proposed by a citizen, only 51% needs to be accomplished. And that was kind of out of what came out of the Charger Stadium issue in 2016, where the original criteria needed was 66%, and then there was some litigation, and they decided that if a citizen proposes a new tax, raising of a tax, or eliminating of a tax, you only need 51% of the population to vote for it. So let's look at some controversial proposition or initiatives that we've seen here in California, in the United States. Proposition 13, and we'll have a video to watch about Proposition 13. This limit property tax to 1% of your assessed value. Prior to Prop 13, your property tax was 3% of your assessed value. So if your home was worth $100,000 in 1978, you would pay $3,000 in taxes. Prop 13 capped that to 1%. So after Prop 13 went in effect, your property tax was now and still is 1% of your assessed value. So if your home was $100,000 in 1978, your property tax would only be $1,000. So you can right away see that there's going to be a revenue gap between this, because you're lowering the amount of revenue that is coming in, and it had a really negative effect on schools, fire departments, police departments, and public services. I think if we were all together, maybe in a class, we could discuss some of the things that we would have wanted in the K through 12 schools, things that are that lack funding, like some sports or maybe some extracurricular activities. A lot of it came as a result of lowering the threshold for property tax, because you're cutting into tax revenue that was going to schools, fire, police, and public services. And in the video, there's going to be a really good kind of discussion about it. So I want you to really pay attention to it. And it kind of tells the story about Howard Jarvis and how he worked to get this proposition passed, to some of his thinking with regards to, maybe we don't need to fund schools or fire departments or police departments as much as we do. It passed with 62% of the vote. Each tax recipient lost funding. California went from first in the nation in education in the 60s to 48th after the passage of Prop 13, sorry. So you can see a lot of money. They lost $3 billion overnight. So a third of that, their usual budget was kind of wiped away. Proposition 8 is another controversial proposition. We'll talk a little bit more about this when we get to the Supreme Court portion. But what Proposition 8 was, it was a constitutional amendment that was attempted to be passed, where it would define marriage to be a relationship between a man and a woman only. It was passed with 52% of the vote. This was later challenged in court cases that we'll talk about down the road when we talk about the legalization of same-sex marriage. But at one time, when Proposition 8 was passed, it was passed with 52% of the vote here in California. So I think, and this happened in 2008. So I think, maybe people might not have known what they're really voting for. It was called the Civil Rights Initiative and Family Initiative. So I think people might have gotten confused by some of the things some of the rhetoric that was put into place. But remember, we talked about Madison and the tyranny of the majority. So we see the majority here wanting something passed that was adversely affecting the rights of a minority group and people in a minority class. So obviously, to prevent tyranny of the majority, there's avenues such as the courts that these same-sex couples were able to use in order to legalize same-sex marriage. And we'll definitely talk about that down the road. Here in San Diego, one of the more controversial propositions in the past 10 years was whether or not we wanted to build the Chargers a new stadium and expand our convention center here in San Diego. It would cost $1.8 billion, would raise hotel tax from 12.5% to 16.5%, and the city would contribute $1.1 billion to build the project. The Chargers would contribute $300 million, and the NFL would contribute $350 million. Now, some of the things that is, if we look at the pros and cons of this, the city would be able to attract Super Bowls. Super Bowl, the Super Bowl officials really find San Diego to be an attractive destination for the Super Bowl due to the weather in January and February, due to the cities, kind of the way things are built, the amount of hotels that we have here. And they had said that if we would have a new stadium here, that we would be in a Super Bowl rotation where the Super Bowl would be in San Diego every 4 years. And the Super Bowl usually generates about $350 million in revenue for the city, whether it's sales tax, hotel tax, people going out and spending money. Another thing was Final Fours generally generates about $300 million for the city. I did some looking, and wrestling generates about $150 million for a city. It would create jobs. We would need to expand the convention center as well. And, every July we have Comic-Con. Comic-Con comes here to San Diego, and they generate about $700 million in that weekend in revenue. And I don't know if any of you have been to Comic-Con, but it's definitely outgrown the convention center that we have here. And I think it would be wise to expand the convention center just to accommodate that, and look how much money it takes in. Now we look at the cons. At the time, only citizens or residents of the city of San Diego could vote on this. Should we be giving billionaires welfare? I mean, the Spanos family were billionaires. And should we, as a city, give them $1.1 billion to build a stadium? Another thing is, if there's cost overruns, the city would have been on the hook for that, which actually happened in LA at the new SoFi Stadium, where I think with some rains that happened, and also the pandemic, it delayed the opening of the stadium and cost a couple of more $1 billion for that stadium to be built, which is actually an incredible stadium. I've been to it, and it's really, really nice and wide and vast, and then very impressive. but you could tell that a lot of money was spent there. Are other things more important, like public parks or libraries? And at that time, you needed a supermajority, the 66% to vote. So it barely got about 43%. So it didn't really come close to passing. So kind of, the Chargers would eventually move to LA. Comic-Con can technically still move to LA. San Diego, I believe, has a contract with Comic-Con through 2024. But there's that area up in LA where they're trying to build, the new Clippers arena, SoFi Stadium, all of that up there, and it might be a very attractive place for the Comic-Con organizers to move. So it's just something that we need to consider. Now, referendum is a little bit different. A referendum is a constitutional amendment that's put forth on the ballot by the Assembly and the Senate for us to vote on. There's some links you can click here, and you can see just by clicking the links when you get a chance. I'm not going to bring it up. When you get a chance, you'll see that the referendum doesn't happen that often. Now, the recall is a power that we have where we can recall an elected official. This could be any state officer or also any local officer, whether it's a governor, lieutenant governor, or secretary of state. The state constitution requires the legislator must provide for the recall of local officers. So we'll talk about that. And we have some examples here. Governor Gray Davis in the early 2000s was recalled from office, led to the election of Arnold Schwarzenegger. There were some concerns about energy usage here in California taxes. We would get something called rolling blackouts at times where you couldn't use your electricity. So a lot of people had a lot of disdain for Governor Davis, and it led to the election of Arnold Schwarzenegger. There was an attempt to recall Judge Aaron Persky, who was the judge that presided in the Brock Turner case. I'm not going to go into a lot of details about the Brock Turner case because it's really infuriating when you look at it. And some of you might be familiar with it, so take a look if you're not. But that judge that made the decision in the Brock Turner case was actually recalled from office in June of 2018. And then more recently, we saw an attempt to remove Governor Gavin Newsom from office, where we had questions about, how the pandemic was being handled, business closures, mask mandates. And when we had the recall vote that was done on September 14, 2021, 62% of the people chose to keep Newsom in office. So basically, in order to recall an elected official, you need to get a petition of 12% of voters in that last office. So if it's a governor office, you will need 12% of the total number of people that voted in the gubernatorial election in the prior term. And you have to have signatures from people from at least 5 different counties. And there's also, some charters here in different cities have ways that you can recall officials. What we'll do next on this video is we'll look at the propositions that are going to be happening in November of 2022, and we'll take a look at those and we'll see what we're going to be voting on coming up. All right, we will do that in a little bit. Okay, everybody, this is a website called Ballotpedia. This is going to preview the 2022 propositions that will be voted on in November of 2022 here in California. So if you look at the highlights here, this page tells you what is going to be put on the fourth in front of us to vote on if you're a voter. We see the highlights here. There's going to be a referendum where a constitutional amendment is proposed to all of us citizens, where we will vote for or against reproductive rights on this ballot. It depends, obviously, how you're going to vote, yes or no. So make sure whatever side you are on, make sure you read it and understand it before you cast your vote. We're also going to have initiatives having to deal with sports betting, art and music education, requirements that dialysis clinics need to adhere to, and a ban on vaping products or flavored vaping products. So let's go ahead and take a look. If you go ahead and go down on this, you could see the ballot proposals right here. So see, we have Proposition 1, which provides a state constitutional right to reproductive freedom, including the right to an abortion. Sounds like a yes vote would protect reproductive rights, and a no vote would take away abortion. So just kind of take a look at that. There's also a couple of propositions, and if you see right here, SS, those are state statutes, so they're not amendments to the Constitution. So these are going to be new laws that are put into place. One is legalizing sports betting at Native American gaming casinos and racetracks here in California. So obviously this affects us here in San Diego because we have Sequan, Barona, Viejas, just right off the top of my head. And also legalizing mobile sports betting and dedicate revenues to homeless advocacy. So if you take a look here, if you click on it, it'll give you a little bit more on who supports it, what a yes vote does, what would it change, and again, here are probably the most important things here. So if you look at it, a yes vote is supported by Pachanga, Agua Caliente band, which are some of the bigger tribes, Barona, and they've raised $773 million to advocate for this. If you look at the no votes, it's kind of what you would expect. People that would be against it: Hawaiian Gardens Casino, California Commerce Club. If you go down to 5, there is a right around Commerce, California, right? Probably a few minutes north of Anaheim when you're going down toward downtown LA. There's a little casino on the side there, and it's a card club. So kind of, maybe they're trying to protect their territory. So it just tells you a little bit about it. Sports betting was made legal nationwide a few years ago, but not all states have adopted it, and California is one of the ones that haven't. And if you ever, try to go on some of the sites like DraftKings or I can't think of the other one off the top of my head, FanDuel. That's what I was thinking about. FanDuel, and they you aren't able to place bets if you are in California. If you look at the other one, here's Proposition 28, which requires funding of education, arts, and music, staffing requirements for dialysis clinics, an increase in personal income tax, to help fund zero emission vehicle projects and prevent wildfires, which is a big deal here in California, and upholds the ban on flavored tobacco sales. So just kind of take a look at this. These are right here where withdrawn. These are initiatives that were withdrawn after signatures were submitted, but then you see here the reason why, and it looks like the legislative branch here in California came to a consensus or came to a compromise with the people that we're trying to change some of these laws here. You can also look and see who gives the campaign contributions here. You can see a lot of money is being spent on the sports betting situation here. And then again, a little bit more of some of the information that we put out in the prior video. So just kind of take a look at it. Yeah, but this is a good resource. If you want to take a look at ballots, you can also look at things that were passed in the past, and what has happened and the differences between a statute and a constitutional amendment and the things that we're going to be voting on here in California. So I think this is a very effective tool to use. Okay, thanks a lot. We'll see you soon. I'm going to actually also clip a video here at the end to kind of explain the separation of powers doctrine in a little bit more detail. Okay, thanks a lot. So, when we talk about separation of powers in the system of checks and balances, it was pretty much put into place that, you don't want any body of government being stronger than the other. And this checks and balances system would be kind of a counterbalancing influence by which an organization or a system is regulated. The problems with this, it can create gridlock, right? The president has the ability to check Congress by a veto. Congress can override the president's veto with a 2/3 majority vote. If there's a law that's passed by Congress and the president vetoes it, Congress can override it, like I said. But also the judicial branch, if they see that law and believe it to be unconstitutional, they can declare it unconstitutional. But in a sense, if a law is declared unconstitutional, one way to make it constitutional is to make a constitutional amendment, and that's a very difficult thing to do. So some of the examples of executive checks are the president can veto laws by Congress. They appoint federal judges, cabinet, and department heads. This has to be confirmed by the Senate. And also can issue executive orders which have the weight of policy or have the weight of law. An example of that is Trump's travel ban that he implemented right when he became president, or the internment of Japanese Americans in 1942. The legislative branch can override the president's veto with a 2/3 vote, like we talked about. They confirm president appointments, and we'll look at some of the politics in that. They can impeach the president. We saw that happen twice in the past 4 years. And they can also check the judicial branch by proposing a constitutional amendment. Now, the courts, remember, the courts granted the power of judicial review through Marbury versus Madison. And they can rule decisions by the legislative branch and the executive branch unconstitutional. In my opinion, this is the greatest power because it's very, very difficult to pass a constitutional amendment. If we want to pass a constitutional amendment, 2/3 of Congress has to vote on it. 3/4 of all state legislatures have to vote on it. So in a sense, it's a very, very difficult thing to do. And if we put the numbers together, you would roughly need 74% of the people to agree on something to get an amendment passed. So that creates a lot of gridlock and a lot of very kind of contentious feelings in Congress. Where, and we see that as individuals, and that's kind of where our trust goes away and we don't see anything getting done. So the last thing we're going to talk about